For your company this morning, the succession of world leaders arriving here for the G20 summit has continued. The big one, US President Barack Obama arriving at the Amberley Air Base southwest of Brisbane, the RAF base, a bit earlier this morning aboard Air Force One. He was then brought to Brisbane's CBD via Marine One, the Sea King helicopter, and well, the talks continue this morning. We'll kick off in terms of bilaterals. Last night the Prime Minister met with the Indonesian President Joko Widodo. This morning he'll be holding talks with the Spanish and Italian leaders, and as we speak these are live pictures of the French President Francois Hollande arriving here in Brisbane. Francois Hollande will be holding bilateral talks with the Prime Minister on Wednesday in Canberra, an official visit to the nation's capital. This is his plane. He's arrived now in Brisbane. He won't be addressing the Parliament, as did the British Prime Minister yesterday, and as will the Chinese President on Monday and the Indian Prime Minister on Tuesday. But the French President will be one of many to have formal bilateral talks with the Prime Minister. As I mentioned last night, the Indonesian leader Joko Widodo, just a few weeks after his inauguration, he's made it to the G20. That was a concern from the government that he might not get here. He has, and the Prime Minister hosted him for dinner last night. With me to discuss all of the various related issues around the G20 is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Let's start with Joko Widodo. Very important to have that meeting with the Prime Minister last night. The government would be pleased that he has attended, even though it is so early in his presidency.
Well, it's a very good sign that he's here, as you say, because there were some question marks as to whether he would attend. But the relationship has seemed to have started very strongly, as it should, because Indonesia and Australia are great friends. Prime Minister Abbott attended the inauguration of Joko Widodo, and he has proved to be somebody who's quite a reformer in his own country and focusing on economic reform. In Australia, there's great capacity to strengthen the relationship. I know Andrew Robb's focusing on how to build the trading relationship. Julie Bishop has built the political relationship. We see thousands of Indonesian students studying in Australia. And
because it's not good enough at the moment, is it? It's quite ridiculous how small the trading flow of dollars is at the moment, given how massive that country is on our doorstep.
Absolutely, 250 million people with annual growth above 5%, and a country which, like Australia, is in the G20, so there is great capacity.
We've just seen pictures there of the US President arriving this morning, greeted by the Governor-General. The Attorney General was there as well, George Brandis, and well, I guess the focus today will be in large part, on the University of Queensland speech, and President Obama to talk about leadership, US leadership in the Asia Pacific, and I guess in the context of a rising China. Do you think that that leadership will continue unabated?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, America has a very strong interest in ensuring stability in the Asia Pacific. It is a Pacific power. It has very close relationships with a number of countries. I mean, 70,000 defence personnel are deployed by the US in both Korea and in Japan. And as you know, there's a lot of tension on the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea. With Japan has been a stable ally of the United States, strong relationships with Singapore, Philippines, obviously the marine rotations through Darwin. So there's a strong defence interest, there's a strong investment and economic interest, and obviously we share very similar values to the United States.
These are pictures of the President's motorcade through the centre of Brisbane. He's staying at the Marriott Hotel, and you can see the wall basically built up around that hotel and throughout large parts of Brisbane. This speech today is also going to touch on climate change and comes in the context of that agreement announced, the deal announced with China. How important is that leading into the big year of negotiations ahead of the Paris summit at the end of next year? This is all about the post-2020 carbon reduction targets, and the US and China, the two biggest emitters, reaching agreement. It's pretty important.
Absolutely, and we welcome that agreement because China and the United States represent about 40% of the world's global emissions, and as you say, it's beyond the 2020 period. Australia and the United States share similar targets for the years leading up to 2020, about a 5% reduction. Now Australia has said that we will establish our targets for that next period next year. But as you say, the Paris meeting is the predominant forum for the climate change discussion. We're going to be focusing on energy efficiency here. There's going to be a very robust discussion in the context of the leaders meeting about how do we create greater transparency for energy markets, security of supply, avoiding embargoes.
But do you accept that a number of the leaders, a number of the countries attending want climate change specifically on the agenda, that this is the first G20 where climate change hasn't been on a formal part of the agenda?
Well, that's not exactly right, Kieran, because at every G20 meeting since Washington 2008 and onwards, we have looked to the United Nations Forum as the key place for the discussion of climate change. Yes, it does come up, but in terms of where the actual real hard discussions take place and discussion about targets, that is for a different forum.
Well, the French president, this is Francois Hollande arriving now. These are live pictures. He and his delegation have just touched down in Brisbane, and I guess it's a timely point because we can refer to the French. They've made $1 billion commitment to the Green Climate Fund. That's the fund to help developing countries mitigate against climate change. Yesterday, the US confirmed it's committing over $3 billion to that GCF for developing countries. This is a bank that the Prime Minister described as the international version of Bob Brown Bank.
No, look, there is a global attempt to put money into this fund to help the mitigation of climate change for developing countries.
Out of touch with what's happening there?
Not at all. We are in close dialogue with our international partners on this issue. We welcome the American commitment. It goes back to a number of years ago, I think Copenhagen, where they decided that there would be a $100 billion target for monies to go into this climate change mitigation for developing countries.
The French provided $1 billion, the Germans have provided $1 billion.
And Japan has supplied $1.5 billion.
So will Australia stump up? We've stumped up nothing.
Well, look, we are in discussions with our partners, and we welcome the Americans' commitment.
Will the Prime Minister agree to it, though? Because, as I say, he's described it as an international version of a Bob Brown bank. That's how he described it.
Kieran, I don't want to preempt any announcements other than to say we take the issue of climate change seriously. We have our own domestic targets. We have our own direct action plan, which has gone through the Senate now. We didn't believe the carbon tax was the right way to go. And it has to be said, even though China and the United States have reached this agreement, you won't see a national carbon tax or emissions trading scheme in the United States, given that the Republicans have got the best record in the Congress for decades. And
but
so that's a reality.
Still enormous steps by the US.
Sure.
They've had the shale gas revolution, which
Absolutely.
has helped them, but also the President putting caps on the emissions of energy regulators, saying you can't go above that. That's a pretty strong move and much tougher than direct action.
Yeah, and certainly Barack Obama is making some strong announcements in this regard, but there's not going to be a carbon tax in the United States. There's not going to be a carbon tax here in Australia.
But is there a chance that this overshadows the G20, the Prime Minister's focus on economic growth? Because
not at all.
The President's done this deal with China. He's got this speech today at UQ, University of Queensland, in which he's going to talk about climate change again, and he obviously wants it on the agenda. And he says, well, if you're not going to put it on the formal agenda, I'll talk about it separately.
Look, for the United States and China to make this agreement, it's a good thing, because don't forget, also China is increasing its emissions for the next 14 years, Kieran. Don't forget that. It's only after 2030 that they believe that their emissions will peak. And in Australia, we're talking about, what is the best mechanism for dealing with 40 million tonnes. Over there, they're talking about billions of tonnes of emissions. But we are focused predominantly here at the G20 summit in Brisbane on a direct economic agenda. One, how to boost employment and growth. Second, how do we increase the resilience of the financial system?
So you don't see it as a distraction, this talk that President Obama is driving on the issue of climate? Because it's a clear effort to precede the G20 with a big speech today and the deal done with China.
Not at all. Look, we've got a very serious agenda, and I think President Obama signs on to that agenda, which is how do you build employment and growth? How do you build financial resilience so we don't get another repeat of the global financial crisis? And how do you make international financial institutions like the IMF more relevant and more representative?
You've got this leaders retreat today where the leaders will sit down, no officials, just the leaders to break the ice. Is there a chance that in that context, as they discuss their priorities, that you get European countries or the US or others saying, well, this is one of our priorities, and it ends up in in the deal?
Look, there are lots of discussions that are taking place. I understand the communique is very well advanced. As Tony Abbott has said, Kieran, it's going to be a tight 3-page communique. Actually, when I was meeting with the Turkish Prime Minister yesterday, he was praising the fact that Australia has kept it to a tight 3-page communique, saying that's a role model for Turkey.
But the Turkish are now saying that the G20 lacks legitimacy unless you talk about the issue that we've been discussing this morning, climate change.
Look, the
That's what the Turkish leader said.
Well, the Turkish Prime Minister yesterday was saying how well Australia has done about in motivating countries to sign on to this Brisbane Action Plan, which is a 2% increase in global growth over and above what would be expected between now and 2018.
Well, let's look at the Russian situation. Where are the ships right now, and what do you make of this show of muscle? I guess it's not the first time. The Russians did it a few years ago when Medvedev was in San Francisco.
Yeah.
It does seem quite odd, though.
Look, it's muscular diplomacy on the part of the Russians and a reflection of their general assertiveness around the globe. The ships are in international waters, they're being monitored, but as you rightly point out, Kieran, whether it was off the Californian coast, whether it was off the Canadian coast, whether it's in relation to Norway or Sweden, you have seen the Russian military deploy their assets, planes and ships very, very close to other countries. Now, it's been reported that NATO has done around 100 interceptions of Russian aircraft just in the last year, 3 times what they did in 2013. As Tony Abbott has said publicly, what Russia does is a matter for them, but how the rest of the world responds is a matter for us. And certainly we have expressed our displeasure with their general assertiveness and the fact that we need greater cooperation in relation to Flight MH17.
Muscular diplomacy, but what do they hope to achieve from this? Is this the Prime Minister yesterday said that, the point that he made to the Russian leader was that they'd be much more respected if they were a superpower for hope as opposed to one trying to recreate the heroics of the Tsarist era or that of Soviet Russia. Is that really what Putin's trying to do here?
Well, look, Putin is a strongman, and he has deployed force, whether it's in Chechnya, whether it's in Georgia, or now in the Ukraine, and certainly that has not been well received by a lot of people in both their region, but also more broadly around the world. And we would call upon Russia to be a good global international citizen and to assist in the recovery of bodies with relation to the downing of Flight MH17.
It doesn't look promising though, does it? I mean, they've talked it up before, they haven't delivered in terms of access. The Prime Minister gave him a blunt message that Australia has information that this rocket did come from Russia, returned to Russia, the rocket launcher. It's hard to be any more blunt than that, and yet still you have this sort of recalcitrance from the Russian leader, showing no sign of apologising. In fact, brings his ships towards Australia.
Well, I won't use that word because I remember that was the word that Paul Keating famously used about Dr. Mahathir. But you are absolutely right. Tony Abbott delivered a very strong message to Vladimir Putin. It was a tough meeting because he said to him that we had information that would indicate that rocket launcher came from Russia. The missile was fired from Ukraine, and then the launcher went back into Russia. And he also pointed out the American experience where they inadvertently downed a civilian plane. They paid proper restitution, and they also made an apology, and we would be looking to Russia to follow that example.
Let's move on and talk about the Chinese leader. He's in town, going to be in Canberra on Monday, where the free trade agreement is more than likely going to be signed. He's an interesting figure, Xi Jinping, because he's really changed the way that the Chinese presidency operates. He's the First Lady has a much greater profile. He's seen to be very much all-powerful within the Chinese Communist Party. Is this a return to the sort of Maoist approach of, the personality cult of the president?
I wouldn't say it's Maoist, but I would say it is a new approach from his predecessors, including Hu Jintao, and he has made a real priority for him to stamp out corruption, and we've seen the large number of arrests of officials who have been engaged in that level of conduct.
How many of those officials are his political opponents? How targeted is this? Is it a purge?
No, I think he's just saying that he wants China to stamp out corruption, and that is to be welcomed. Look, China is a growing economy. It's Australia's largest trading partner, $150 billion, Kieran, of two-way trade. We began negotiations on a free trade agreement in 2005, the same year that New Zealand did. New Zealand concluded an agreement in 2008, and only now do we look like concluding one in 2014. Andrew Robb deserves a lot of credit for that. This is going to set Australia up for decades, if not generations.
Would we be careful, though, in terms of, or cautious in terms of handing over any Chinese citizens that are in Australia that the Chinese accuse of stealing money? You obviously be very careful, surely, given the suggestions that he's targeting political opponents here.
We would comply with all international obligations and protocols and obviously respect the right of Australian citizens first and foremost.
This report on the front page of The Australian today about a new energy agency, can you explain what that is about? And would the oil exporters, like the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia and others, will they accept a new agency over the top to govern resources and energy?
Well, Kieran, the countries that are represented here at the G20 represent around 82% of the world's consumption of energy. So they are the big players. So if you're going to get an agreement here, it's very important. What we are focused on is getting greater security of supply, avoiding embargoes, getting greater transparency around pricing, ensuring that there's a viability of the energy system, because over 1.2 billion people don't have electricity in the world. That's remarkable. And Australia has a big role to play here because we are going to be the world's biggest LNG exporter in just a few years' time. The International Energy Agency is largely made up of OECD developed countries. So China, India, South Africa, Brazil are not members of the International Energy Agency. So 55% of the world's energy consumption is not represented in the International Energy Agency. So this is an issue that needs to be discussed. I don't think they're going to announce this weekend. I might be corrected, but I don't think they're going to announce the creation of a new agency. What they would probably look to do is agree on the principles that would form part of any new organisation.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, thanks. Good to chat.
Great to be with you, Kieran.
A quick break on Saturday Agenda. Stay with us, back in just a moment.